Hello and welcome to the future of personalised learning using new technologies to create new student pathways, the latest in a series of webinars held in collaboration between Times Higher Education and Amazon Web Services. My name's Ashton Wenborn and I'm the Special Projects Deputy Editor at THE, and I'm delighted to be joined today by an expert panel from academia and industry. So allow me to introduce Ian Pickup, Pro Vice Chancellor of Education and Experience and COO at the University of East London. Gerd Kortemeyer, Director of Educational Development and Technology at ETH Zurich. Sam Blythe, Director of Partnerships and Business Development at PebblePad. And Jude Sheeran, Principal of International Education and Research at Amazon Web Services. So thank you to our panel for joining us today. When we talk about personalised learning, it's in the wake of substantial transformation in the higher education industry. EdTech has become an essential part of the student journey and digitally supported learning is here to stay. So how can educators make the most of the many new tools that are available to them, specifically in terms of personalised learning and creating new student pathways? I'd like to begin today's discussion by asking how greater personalisation can help increase access to higher education. Perhaps we could go first to Ian and you can tell us a bit about your experience at the University of East London.
Thank you, Ashton. So obviously in the last year and a half, all of us in this sector have had to, the word is pivot, isn't it? Pivot to using technology really rapidly to engage with existing students, but also to onboard and get started students at a greater distance than ever before. And certainly from our own experience in East London, students have welcomed the opportunity and the ability to start their learning in the least, in many cases, some distance from campus. And so the ability to enroll, to be inducted and to orientate oneself to the virtual learning environment in a seamless way, in a way, of course, driven by investments and developments in technology, has been broadly welcomed for many of our students. The ability to engage both synchronously and asynchronously, to self-pace and to go back and revise and rewind and make sure that one has accessed the right information at the right time for them is obviously an advantage. However, we also need to really guard against the notion that that accessibility, that increase in accessibility, is a taken for granted, is a given. Of course, in the UK, we talk broadly, largely around secondary education, around digital poverty, and that is a real thing. And we know that students through to our university and indeed across the sector aren't all able to access the same level of technology to drive their personalisation and to drive their access in that sense. And that's certainly for us a real watchword and a real focus for us to reduce inaccessibility, to increase accessibility therefore, and to really get to some of the root causes of inequalities, to ensure that all of our students, whatever their background, whatever their starting point in their personalised journey, are able to benefit from these opportunities to engage, so that everyone gets that benefit.
Thanks, Ian. And Gerd, I'd really like to hear from you about whether you've had the same sort of experience of flexibility being a positive outcome and the potential barriers to access being a challenge, or have you had, I don't know, a fairly different takeaway in terms of personalisation?
I would not say no. We are dealing with what many other universities are also dealing with, increasing student numbers. Of course, we have a much more diverse, much more global student population than we had before. We are having more diversity in background. I think we share that with many institutions. And also we are thinking, of course, about lifelong learning opportunities, and people are being at different stations in their life, having different requirements, but also coming with a very different package of life experiences and abilities to accommodate such a diverse student population. Yes, you would like to look at personalization. At the same time, we do not want to lose our character as a presence university, as a face-to-face university. Higher education is more than just knowledge. It is also kind of an acclimatization to an academic environment. It is networking, it is peer support. And what we are struggling with is the notion, what should we look like in this kind? How can we balance personalized education with what we also value, peer support, networking, and how can we make sure that these diverse learners don't just stay in their bubble, because we have not achieved very much if we don't widen the horizon, and if we are just staying with personalized learning where people are sitting in their basement and getting exactly what they need, we may actually just leave them exactly where they came from, just with a little bit more content knowledge. So that one is what's our role here in this post-pandemic world?
Thank you, Sam. A lot of that seemed to really resonate with you, and I think as you know, an industry voice in today's discussion, how have the demands of your educating partners changed over the last year, or even further back? You can tell us a little bit about that, and maybe just let us know a brief summary of what PebblePad is trying to achieve in that space as well.
Yeah, you're right. I think a lot of what Gert and Ian said resonated. And I think when we think about accessibility and diversity, I think that what's driven, even before COVID, we were seeing, and I'm sure you all recognise, a real kind of greying or a blurring of the lines between different types or sectors in education. So I think we see universities delivering apprenticeships, we see vocational and FE colleges delivering degrees, but also reaching back down into the kind of traditionally secondary education sphere. And then we have OPM providers and specialist universities who are delivering what used to be quite a niche solution and now is increasingly less niche. So I think as a sector, as an organisational group, universities have quite a challenge, as you said, Gert, to kind of what is their role? What's the role of a university in delivering, you know, career-ready, employable-ready graduates and members of society? And I think that was happening before COVID. That's expedited, like so many things, exponentially. And I think where we see PebblePad fitting into that is helping to smooth out those blurs and helping to smooth out and helping balance that real institutional strategic initiative, you know, those things like employability, like academic integrity, like competency or research problem-based learning, those very high level crucial strategic initiatives, but then also how do we balance that with the needs of the medical department and the, you know, the vocational department and the business schools. So where we fit in and what we're seeing is helping to balance that tension sometimes between, you know, those sometimes very different needs. And I think in terms of personalisation, I also think that we need to rethink or clarify what we mean by learning, because historically what we saw and was sometimes classed as learning management systems were very much content delivery and teaching management platforms rather than a very pedagogical based tool. So I think I also really see a huge amount of interest in pedagogy. What can technology do to support pedagogy, not just the admin side of teaching and learning?
Thank you. Your point about what we mean by learning, I think, is something that Gerd touched on previously. You know, instead of creating extremely knowledgeable students, as Gerd said, sat in their basement who could speak for hours on their topic, but perhaps aren't particularly well prepared for the world of work, networking and interactions. I think that certainly seems like something that educators and platforms like PebblePad and AWS are really having to adjust to now. Jude, is that something that you're really seeing a greater demand for?
Yeah, well, it's certainly something that there's a huge amount of focus on, and rightly so. But may I just say, what an amazing start to the discussion. Some fascinating responses, and I'll do my best to keep the quality up. As Gerd said, this is, you know, the flip side of a more intensive personalized experience is questions around the co-curricular, the life skills that students pick up when they go to university. That's critical, some would argue more critical than the knowledge that they acquire or the learning that they carry out. And my daughter just finished the first very strange year at university, and her choice was based entirely on opportunities to become a rounded human being. The academic side, which was on offer from many, many universities, for her was less of a priority, which I think is reassuring. In any case, when we, and as Ian said, you know, this has been such an extraordinary 18 months or so. It's a real Rubik's Cube now of challenges that universities are facing. Most of the challenges are pre-existing, of course, but they've been recontextualized, resurfaced by the pandemic. And we at UEA, I think they refer to dual learning. Other institutions talk about flexible or hybrid. What personalized learning means to many, though, in addition to that flexibility, is a style of teaching and learning that enables students to have a more individual experience, rather than this thousands of years old factory model where we convene students. I used to be a teacher, convene them and expect them to learn in the same way at the same rate, disappear, come back tomorrow and repeat the process. And of course, that's crazy. In reality, we're all individuals that learn in different ways at different rates. And so if the question is, how can personalized education increase access to higher education? If we look at that element of this much broader term, or rather this much broader range of issues that personalized has come to refer to, I think what personalized education should do, notwithstanding the very serious issues around how we complement that with life skills, co-curricular and so on, is give something of a leveling up a capability to tutors and institutions, such that students are able to learn in a more individualized manner, which enables them to fulfill their potential. And that isn't only about students keeping up with the rest of the class, it's about particularly gifted students being able to fulfill their full potential. And so I think the answer in small part is that students should be able to learn deeper, faster, etc., and therefore get places on courses at universities that they want to. And in addition, those that are able to push themselves further may get further than they would have if they were in some ways restrained by this factory model.
Thank you, Jude. I wonder, we've fairly briefly touched on some of the risks of greater personalisation in terms of that face-to-face interaction element, you know, the becoming a well-rounded human being. But are there any other risks that you're aware of that you hope to tackle as we move forward, whether from a university perspective in the way that you use platforms, or as a platform yourself in terms of things that you've thought, this isn't working and we have to stop moving forward with this? Ian, I'm happy to come back to you on that.
No, well, if that, oh yes, sorry.
Oh, go on, Jude, go ahead now. Judith, go ahead.
You're closer to students, so it'd be great to hear from you. I'm very happy to follow.
Well, I will come back to that question of risk, Ashton, but before I do that, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of other things. So the notion of what young people, what our students, what older people indeed, across what we could refer to as the 60-year curriculum, that lifelong aspect of learning. What are people learning, when and why and how? They're huge questions. And it's been touched on here, the notion of curricula and curriculum substance, be it subject-based, disciplinary focused, linked to professional standards in some employment sectors, of course. There's there's kind of a vertical, silo almost of knowledge. And we've also referred to, I think Jude talked about the co-curricular. Actually, I think what we're seeing and what we're understanding by the word learning is a blurring of those components. And in fact, from a psychological perspective, what we're looking at is learning and development, learning and personal development in terms of skills and competences, learning and professional development in terms of one's career planning and career readiness and career preparedness for my career of the future, if I'm talking about me in this case as the learner. So how as a university we plan for that and deliver that using technology to drive and empower is a really point in focus for us. And actually, long before the pandemic came, something we did, we revalidated all of our courses, so all students at all levels in all subjects have a core module in every year of study that we call professional fitness. We call it professional fitness and mental wealth. And that focuses on a sort of a spiral curriculum of a number of cross-cutting competences. But for us, the key thing there is that's in the curriculum. It is no longer co-curricular, although we have co-curricular too, running in parallel, because the curriculum is the only place where all students need to be, and therefore could be seen as most inclusive in that regard. And that's at the heart of our curriculum. How we use technology to help drive those personal and professional development aspects for this webinar is really key. And as all good educators would talk about, certainly in early childhood and in the sort of compulsory education space, educators talk about starting from the child. So it's not a deficit model. And I think this brings me on to the risk aspect. So thanks for bearing with me. On the risk side is we have a list of skills and competencies and academic credentials coming through the pipeline to a university. And we identify the gaps using our systems, using the data-informed approaches, using machine learning. We say, yeah, we know what you know, but here's the bits you don't know, so we signpost you to those. Now, actually, if we're not careful, there's a risk in that approach that it very quickly becomes a deficit model and starts to forget all of the life experiences, all of the strengths, all of the opportunities for learning and self-development that a student has been through across their life experience to date on arrival at an institution like a university. So somehow we need, in terms of mitigating against that risk, we have to help the learner be personalized, the learning journey be personalized to upskill, to reskill, but not forget the strengths and not forget the individual's ownership and agency in that, in goal setting, in objective setting, in choice of what one does next. And I think the combination of those two things becomes a really powerful way of thinking through that, how we help learning go wider and deeper and faster for all of our learners, whatever their starting point.
Thank you. You spoke about students perhaps turning up to university with the skills that they've gained during their previous education. Do you think that there's an opportunity for greater collaboration between different education stages and platforms? So I'm thinking, for example, if something like PebblePad is supporting students throughout their journey, can we use that data from perhaps even primary school, secondary school, throughout those key stages up to university and even post-university to facilitate lifelong learning, so that instead of working with that deficit model that you mentioned, Ian, that we can really identify what each student has learned and where they can benefit from greater personalised teaching and learning moving forward. Sam,
I absolutely agree that there's a place for data, but I think data is a very, very rightly hot topic and potentially a controversial topic, which I'm happy to address. But to take almost the data out of it, I feel actually what we should all be doing, and is incumbent on all of us, is to help to develop professional learners. So we've all heard the cliche about the jobs of the future that aren't invented, probably for us, all of us in our lifetime, I suspect. But I also think not just in terms of career development and employability, but helping individuals help themselves to become future ready, I think is an absolutely core skill that we could and should be developing from, you know, infant school up to whichever kind of stage of education you kind of end up on, but also not just education. So I think what we try and do with PebblePad is to give the tools and resources and the support ecosystem to help organisations really scaffold the learning and the understanding of students' own learning to help them future-proof themselves. So exactly as Ian described, of course we want people to have a curriculum. I want my doctor to learn how to be a doctor, but I also want them to learn how to be empathetic, how to work with others, how to do what has sometimes been described as soft skills. And I also want my doctor to be ready to go into a different career as and when they want to. So I think that concept of developing professional learners and understanding and scaffolding their own learning is actually more important than the way we use data, although I do believe that has its place.
I hear always the way that we use data, and the more I think about that, I think it shouldn't be us who are using data, not us as the institution, but it should be the learner themselves who are using their data. And when you talk about the lifelong learning journey and you said going back to data from elementary school, well, who owns that data? Whose data is that actually of what? Well, actually, I don't want to remember what I did in elementary school, but nevertheless, so who owns that data? It's the learner who owns that data. So I really think one model for the future for the data is that the learner is taking the data with themselves, kind of like those virtual patient records that are now being increasingly considered. And then as they go from institution to institution, they have their data with them, and they may even have their own electronic tutor that they bring with them that is in their employ. It's not us who should use their data. The moment that we use the data, we are in danger.
In your view of, I feel like there are two very distinct kind of data models. There's personal data about me as an individual, which of course I agree should be mine, but I also feel that there are such valuable outcomes and decisions around how and when and what we teach our learners that can be used from anonymized aggregated data, that it would be such a shame if we didn't separate those two kind of questions and those two outcomes for our institutions and learners.
I agree with you there. Those are very different kind of data. The depersonalized data that an institution might actually reliably use, but then there is click data, there's analytics data that I think belong to the learner themselves. But that's, yeah, and then there's the role of the institution. We had talked a lot about teaching so far, but we have another role, and it is the certification of learning. In the end, we are still giving out degrees. And if we graduate a mechanical engineer, there is an expectation that in the work market, it means something to have a degree in mechanical engineering from our particular institution. And that's important for the student also in terms of competitiveness. The employers need to know what they're getting. And that's a little bit of a danger that I also see with personalized learning. At some point in time, we need to bestow something on the learner that ends up in their data, that is certifiable, and that is a degree. And I know we are talking a lot these days about nano degrees or micro certificates. We are currently not going there because we don't quite know what those will mean in the workplace in terms of competitiveness. But that's yet another kind of data that we have. And that's the certified learning outcomes that somehow need to travel along with the learner.
Yes, those micro-credentials are certainly something that keeps coming up, and I think that people see a huge opportunity for students to be able to pursue paths that engage them, that they can be really successful at. But it's certainly a good point that if people are picking and choosing from all sorts of fields, then you end up getting a potentially fairly strange collection of skills that don't translate in the workplace. So do any of you see a way that we can allow that kind of self-created degree in a way that also can lead a student to say, I have the skills to do this job, so employ me?
I have a real life example from the University of Edinburgh, who have this really kind of ambitious and creative concept of it's student-centered and student-led, individually created course. And so this is a way of a student creating their own path using their own subject. So of course you need your doctor, your engineer, your architect to have the skills that they have to have, and they need to be able to evidence and to be accredited on those skills. But the way that they get there, their journey, their learning journey to get to those competencies is also just as valuable in a different way. And so that concept of having a student co-create their own curriculum or their own journey through the curriculum, I think is really powerful. And I see that as a way that a lot of institutions will go. That concept that there are, of course, key competencies that have to be achieved, but there are also huge benefits on that whole co-curricular approach and the bringing in, crucially, of experiences and skills from outside the classroom. So I think I feel like that's a really powerful example of how you can use technology to deliver a really creative assessment and really authentic, personalized assessment, but do it at scale. And personalization at scale, I think, curate sounds stupid, but I think is essential if we're going to balance, as Gert said, that balance of between graduate attributes. And I am a graduate of the University of Edinburgh. However, I have also got my own path that I've taken. I find that a really interesting model.
So if I may come in as well there, actually, I mean, really interesting stuff, isn't it? Because part of the visioneering that we've all been close to over the past few years has projected this move into micro-credentials, stackable credit, portability. And we're all trying to work out what blockchain means in this respect. And I'm still scratching my head on that one. So fabulously interesting. But actually, let's not lose sight of the fact that learners' understanding of where they're at in their own learning varies hugely. So me, as a 50-something-year-old, middle-class guy, I've got a really clear notion of what I need to do to get, wherever I want to go next. And there might be a short course. Speed might be really important. Doing it purely online might be the interesting thing. But actually, for a school leaver who may be first in their family to go to university with no prior familial experience or understanding of the rules of the game and the rules of engagement through that learning journey towards graduation, towards first graduate job, or to an internship placement as part of that journey. That level of individual and personal understanding of where one is at varies hugely. So to best use the technology, to best use the data, and I agree with Gert here in terms of putting that knowledge in the hands of the learner. There's a role for all of these tools to best inform a learner to understand where they're at. So that's about self-reflection, but it's also then about scaffolded planning forward. So then it's about teams of academics and professional advisors to help ensure that journey can be self-shaped, but with the full knowledge of what it all means. And I think there's something in that sharing of data with students, and we've done a bit of this. So we have a student dashboard now at UEL that is essentially a representation of attendance on campus when that's possible, and of course it hasn't always been possible this year, and it is brought together in an algorithm with engagement in our VLE and engagement in our Teams platform, and it's crunched into a score with arrows and colours and so on. But of course students see that and then say, okay, so my engagement score is good, so what does that mean? And so what we then need to do be able to power conversations between people, advisor, academic, student, that says, actually, you're here. And actually what we can see is people who've engaged in these ways, in these things, have gone on to do X, Y, and Z, or their outcomes academically or professionally have been shaped by the choices that have been made. So that's done that retrospective, reflecting back to the learner, using the data of how choices might impact on that next step, both academically and professionally. And that's where I think it gets really interesting. And that's where the use of machine learning, predictive analytics, and so on can really add value to that individual level of understanding of where they're at now as a learner and where they can go next with success in mind.
I really agree, Ian, with your point about if we can kind of have this idyllic idea that we give students data about the way that they've learned and they'll be empowered to make their own decisions. But actually, for most people, that amount of big data, even just referring to one individual, is quite overwhelming. So are universities in a position where they can work with students to help them make the most of that data without it kind of trespassing into you know, a kind of controversial, difficult, you know, who has the right to this data kind of aspect? Can we work together and use it really well? And if we can, what exactly can educators and universities take to say to students, this is how we're gonna adapt your student path based on data we've collected? Often attendance is kind of used as like the #1 most useful, obvious piece of data to work with, but perhaps it's a little bit, I don't know, how useful is that? How useful is something like that? Is there more interesting data that we can work with?
I would kind of say we actually have very little data. And the data that we have is extremely noisy and not necessarily reliable. You said attendance. What does that mean? So at the moment I'm attending this webinar here and I'm talking to you, and just this second an email came in and you saw my looking to the side, who emailed me there? I'm drinking my cup of coffee. We had really done a lot of things on attendance. We looked at what does a hit on a page actually mean? We tried to figure out how long does it have to take to be a meaningful attendance of a particular web page. People are very irrational. People are behaving in very strange ways. We are also only seeing what they see through their screen. We do not see what they do with their neighbor. We do not see if they discussed anything. We do not see if they picked up a library book. We don't see what they did on Google while they were, attending our class. That's very unreliable data. We also see all kinds of effects of peer interaction. We analyzed the data for what you may just call, that was at another institution, but for what copying might do. What people get out of social media as they are working on homework problems. The data gets very diluted with the data of other people. So I actually question that we have as much useful data as you think. The last thing is we don't even know what we ourselves are doing. The metadata on our content, the electronic content, is very thin. We don't really know any contextual thing about our own content. And if you work on the curricular level, oftentimes it's very hard to specify what the learning outcomes of a particular course are. Of course, we can put something in the syllabus, but is that really what we do? So I think there's a lot of research that needs to happen. And yes, we get gigabytes of data, but I don't think they are as useful as we hope.
I'd like to return to our conversation that we began earlier about access and perhaps broadening participation. I wonder how technology can be adapted for different kinds of learners in order to open up the higher education space to anyone who wants to access it. Perhaps things like recorded lectures and other digital assets can increase access and aid engagement. Jude, perhaps you can talk about the way that AWS's platform can aid those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, it's not really for us to figure out how these monumental issues are solved. We exist to build technologies and co-innovate with our customers, with universities, with schools, with governments, research institutes and the like, to put that technology to work for whatever cause or whatever solution they have in mind. Having said that, because we work with so many worldwide, we see very different trends emerging in different parts of the world. And so, you know, we saw the sort of, I think it was MIT or someone that launched the whole MOOC movement, which gave access to normal human beings to this amazing content. And that continues to grow. And then there's a whole ecosystem of players that have surrounded that and try to augment it and get it to people. I think in many ways, and the technology is there. The technology is ahead of the decisions that schools, universities and the like are making about how they reach learners worldwide at any age. And so our job is, you know, for example, we were talking earlier about privacy and controlling personal information. That is a very personal, national, institutional decision. What we're focused on is security, protecting the data. How it's used is up to our customers, and we work with them to figure that out. So it's fascinating working with universities all over the world in very different contexts to try and reach their learners in very, very different ways. And the technology, I feel, is sort of ahead of the curve in that it's there. It can, you know, Ian was talking earlier about some of the things that they're doing at UEL, at ASU, Arizona State, and in the States. They're a few years ahead and are using data not only to spot and prompt interventions, but predict when a student's going to go off track and offer them alternative courses to enable them to complete their degree. In the context of sort of making available content to other learners outside of the university, in theory, the same technologies could apply. But I suspect it'll be a different version, a different twist on the use of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and predictive analytics.
And maybe one of our university voices could just comment on that aspect, that access aspect of personalised learning and digital tools. Ian, I'm not sure if that's something that you found a lot easier to do, given the digital transformation we've witnessed.
Easier, probably no, because it's a really complex thing, isn't it? And I suppose what it enables, or what we found we're better able to start to do, is this notion of spotting gaps, using the technology to help us identify gaps in attainment and rates of retention, attrition, and progression to graduate outcomes. I think, and obviously all English-based HE institutions who are OFS regulated, a few caveats on that, have an access and participation plan that is now very much focused on smart targets around gaps in and across the learning journey. So, for example, you know, as in very many institutions, you know, the gap between the degree attainment level between particular groups of students, you know, can be sliced and diced in different ways. But generally, sector-wide, we recognise the notion of an attainment gap between Black and white students, and that's a global phenomenon, certainly in the northern hemisphere. So, you know, how do we best use data to focus our efforts to reduce such gaps? And that's a really good, common example across the sector. And so once you get into that data, and of course the machinery and the technology helps you identify those gaps, if we can get to that point of using that pre-entry data, demographic data, understanding your prior life experience, to start to then map, model, predict, and intervene before things either go wrong or before attainment and progression goes off track, then of course that is a huge advantage for all of the institutions to work towards ever better outcomes for students. I guess in part it feels like a bit of a holy grail, however, So the challenge is, you know, we can do some of that work, we can start to predict, but then where I think we're accelerating and we're catching up, and Judy mentioned the US context, it's then knowing which interventions best work for which students. So, and of course, that data set takes time to work through because it's contextualized to a particular moment in time. So what works now might not have worked 5 years ago or even 2 years ago. What works in 5 years' time, we haven't yet necessarily imagined and got the wherewithal to deliver. So there's that time-based piece that's always moving, and there's always the socio-cultural dimension of wherever our institutions are anchored and the students that we serve. So there's some moving parts around those things that mean it's almost a never-ending piece of work, really focusing on those which interventions for which students at which point in time of that learner journey. But I think, you know, most institutions now are working towards those ends, and in some cases, certainly over the last year and a half, we've certainly seen, you know, some positive movements around retention, around progression rates, around degree outcomes, because of some of those efforts that have been driven partly through technology, partly forced upon us by the circumstance of distance. But we, I think within that, have got towards more inclusive approaches and approaches that can be more personalised at the level of intervention and proactive educative experiences.
You spoke about, sorry, Gerd, go ahead.
I just wanted to agree with Ian. Access to higher education materials is not the problem. Jude already mentioned MIT's Open Courseware initiative that came out. All of the curricular materials from MIT are openly available, yet not all of us are MIT engineers. Why not? And that's exactly where Ian comes in. So actually, I was just agreeing with Ian.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on your point, Ian, about you sort of questioned what point in the learner journey do we intervene? And I think if we're talking about access to higher education, actually joining that and thinking this is a space that I should be in, really is that point of intervention before students start thinking about university, perhaps before they even start thinking about their A-levels or, you know, whatever the equivalent is in the country that they're studying in. So at what point and how can universities or further higher education providers, when do they step in to make sure that the students who come to them to enroll are diverse and, you know, like have the access to that education? Sam, that seems like something that you've been thinking a lot about.
It really is, and I think if I could kind of summarise the questions that we're being asked and the conversations we're having with our university partnerships at the moment, it's all about transition and onboarding. And that transition is not just from secondary school to university, it's from that really, really crucial year 1 to year 2. It's from end of undergraduate to postgraduate. So it's how do we understand that journey for our students, and then how, as you said, how do we understand where and how and what should be the intervention? And I think what we're seeing is two really distinct models. The first, I think, is really interesting. We haven't touched much on the process of application, and I think Royal College of Arts are doing something really innovative in terms of they are starting their process of engaging with students really early in the application process to help make sure there's a real equity across the institution in terms of what application is like, but that they are also at that point starting to scaffold their future students and help them understand how to learn better, how to gather evidence and skills. So I think that application process is going to be more and more important as, in some cases, that the actual the profile of applicants is going to change dramatically, and we've seen institutions whose application profile has changed 80% from international to domestic, and that's fantastic that they are oversubscribed, but their profile is going to mean their transition process has to totally change. So I think application and onboarding is really a crucial element, and then that transition. So I think, again, going back to that concept of building professional learners, where we stand as a technology partner is to help organisations really easily scaffold and scale how they teach their learners to learn, and how to understand what their own competencies are and what their progress is, and if they can understand that as learners, that of course makes the organisation's job much easier. And I think that's where data should come in. I think we're looking at data historically based on things that we used to think were important, and I think there's still value in that. But actually, maybe what we should be doing is thinking, what are our graduate attributes? What does it mean to be a learner? Who and what are we trying to build for the future in our students? And then build data points that can investigate that, so that we can make those decisions.
Good. I wonder if you've been rethinking the application and onboarding process in the ways that Sam mentioned.
Well, I mean, our university happens to not have an application process for people who come from Switzerland. They need just the equivalent of a high school diploma to enter our university. But also, I don't think our goal should be that necessarily every single student goes to college. I don't think that every single person needs to have or wants to have higher education. Some people may be much happier being a really good car mechanic, and we shouldn't downplay that. We all need that. We need good plumbers, artists, we need poets, we need, I mean, our society needs more than just people who went through some particular higher education curriculum. So I think helping people make the right life choices for them, and respecting that the right life choice might not be higher education, is something that we shouldn't forget in all of this. Yeah, the other thing you talked about, personalized learning and adaptivity of learning, looking at the attributes of the learner. And I think we should not totally neglect intentional mismatch, because people do need to be stretched sometimes. Yes, I have my comfort zone. And if the attributes lead to the fact that I always stay in my comfort zone, I won't develop. So sometimes I think adaptivity can also mean, you know what, I'm just going to make you do group work. I know you like so much more to be in your basement and work by yourself, and you want the tinkering time, but I'm going to make you do group work, even though you don't like it. So attributes shouldn't mean that I get exactly my comfort zone.
I suppose that's almost a different kind of personalization, isn't it? If we identify the things that people are intentionally avoiding, then we can push them in that way. But certainly it's important not to say, this works, let's do this and only this for the student. Definitely.
Ashton, may I just come in there?
Yes, do.
Just something that really sort of piqued my interest in making a comment. So thank you, Gerd. I mean, the notion of personalization, and yes, of course, society needs all sort of shapes, sizes of people's interests, motivations, skills, and talents. And I think, again, it's back to that question about risk, and it's the risk to do with anything that we might do to people. We might sift and put them into a particular funnel or a particular learning journey that we think is most suitable to them. And of course, we all know people, present company accepted possibly, that had a terrible time in compulsory education, but then through opportunities, through hard work, through perseverance and resilience, came through to be professors or world leading experts in a variety of fields. And I think we need to be ever so careful that any sifting and sorting that we might do. And in the UK, you know, someone went to a grammar school because at the age of 10 and a half, I was deemed intelligent enough to go on to a particular school where good friends of mine weren't, and they were sorted into a different life chance kind of funnel. And of course, the data that we have being powerful in that regard might see us trying to sift and sort in ever more sophisticated ways. And I think we need to be really careful with that, but it's not limiting, and it doesn't limit aspirations and ambitions in that regard. But of course, if someone's entering a new space, a new life opportunity, you know, if I'm the first in my family to go to university this September, the last 2 years I've not really been in school an awful lot, and I haven't got a clue really what to expect. And I might have been to a virtual open day, but that might be it. Depending on the school I've been to and the college I've been to before going off to university, I might have had some really good advice from my school teachers, but in some cases I might not have. And so, of course, people are stepping out of the comfort zone. Many of our learners step out of that comfort zone, you know, every start of academic year, every day of coming into campus, perhaps in some cases. So that notion of transition, moving through a stage of liminality, you know, between and betwixt the place of knowing myself. And actually, that of course, as educators, is a powerful space. Some of the best learning is when we need to work to get that penny to drop, or to have that light bulb moment, and then we can move on. Some of the best learning and transformative learning happens in that space. But of course, we have to scaffold and support students through that space, wherever that might be on their particular journey. And so for us, you know, an awful lot of work going into the start of our next academic year, given the challenges that learners will have had before they arrive with us. And focusing on those competencies, but also looking at that through a wellness perspective. So the notion of community wellness, personal wellness, financial wellness as part of that transition in the first semester. And we're really focusing hard now to make sure that is as individualized as possible for our learners. And of course, there's a place for technology to help with that, but there's also that excitement. Certainly I've got excitement, but we can tell, thinking about thousands of people on our campuses again, because hearing people laugh from your office window is something that hasn't happened to me very often when I've been in these types of situations over the last year and a half. That interhuman connectivity is as powerful as the data-rich, technology-enhanced aspects of our delivery. So it's getting best of both worlds, I think, as part of that solution.
Yeah, I totally agree in that, Ian, and I think that concept of part of the role, or a big part of the role of kind of institutions and educators is that well-being, and it reminds me of Leeds, who have been using their kind of academic tutoring as also a way of helping to make sure that wellness, and particularly mental health, over the last 12 to 18 months is something that's absolutely at the forefront. And I also think that's a really important factor of personalisation. It's not just academic personalisation, although I do think that's important. It's the students genuinely feeling, and they're being able to do that at scale, genuinely feeling that the meetings they have with their tutor are personal. It's not just, have you read the book and tell me about Chaucer? It's genuinely kind of a real opportunity to talk about the whole person.
Jude, you also maybe had a point to raise there, I think.
Just very briefly, because I know we're running out of time. I think it's both depressing and really uplifting that never before have educators had such opportunity to reach, and it is in the billions of people who had no access to education. It's very easy to remain, and I do this all the time as a former tutor, you sort of remain in your space, but the opportunity for universities in nations like the UK to reach people is truly extraordinary. What I think we would all be good to focus on and work together on is the breaking down of those barriers. If you accept that education is a right, or at least a great thing for humanity, what can we do together to work on digital poverty, the socioeconomic barriers to billions of people gaining access to basic experiences, So it's both kind of uplifting that never before have educators had access to so many people and had the opportunity to have such a great impact using technology that's available today. At the same time, as being somewhat depressing in that we can't quite get there for very different reasons. We've got the content, we've got great teachers, we've got the technology. We have some technology. What we don't have is that connectivity and policy in some countries that let us down.
Thank you. We've got just a few minutes left, so I think I'd love to speak more certainly about digital poverty that Jude just raised, and actually a lot more about that well-being and mental health. I think it looked to me that Gerd, you really agreed with what Sam was saying about supporting student mental health, and I wondered if in our last few minutes you wanted to comment at all on how we can better do that, and actually what we're doing well so far.
Yeah, I mean, we did student surveys, of course, during COVID to see how our students are doing. We did course evaluations in an expanded way. And one thing that we found very interesting is the courses that were rated high had two common features. One of them was innovation. Okay, so people looked at creative use of modern technologies in order to convey the content. The other part that made a good course, which we just hadn't expected, was empathy. When we looked at those things, in the end, what it boiled down, the second ingredient of a good course was empathy on the part of the instructor and empathy on the part of the fellow students. And we also looked strongly at our mental health resources that we are offering on our campuses, because this time has been very taxing for people. And we are hiring new coaches to work with students there. So, but yeah, I mean, this empathy thing, we had not expected that in course evaluations. We hadn't seen it before. And now suddenly it was a consistent pattern. Do people care about me as a person and not just about differential equations?
Yes, and I think that brings us perfectly up to time with a bit of a reminder to be a little bit more empathetic in our day-to-day lives. So thank you to all of you for joining us today for some really interesting insights and useful discussion on this topic. I would love to speak with you all again soon, so hopefully we can make time to do that. But for now, I would just like to reiterate thank you for joining us, and goodbye.